exactly. It's coming fast. I think a few young kids help as well. So just to kind of open up why transformations fail. And I think what we're seeing is the world is changing. In the last few years that we've kind of already touched on, it's gone from being negotiating effectively with a Microsoft or Oracle for your on-premise, very static licensing, built in a certain way. When they don't have visibility, actually what we're talking about there is very much around software license compliance and software license management functions. And again, when you're starting out, this is always a good place to start, because actually you're starting to understand what's out there. You're normalizing that information. You may be focusing on a few vendors and you're starting to understand. But where we're getting hit with today is all these other things in the corner are now coming in, making what we thought was simple and we just started to figure out much more complex. And I think it's kind of turned on its head a little bit what ITAM is and how we start to engage. So then we think about SAM and actually what's our life cycle process? What happens when someone requests a piece of software? How does that get approved? How does that get assigned, controlled, provision, managed? And increasingly, a lot of the organizations we're working with, the actual business requirement is coming from the sourcing team. So actually where there's a shift towards much more agile working, where there's a customer service type approach of giving good employee service and satisfaction. How do we get a bit of software to somebody when they request it? We check if we need a license, we fulfill that. Maybe that's a SaaS application, maybe that sits in a different area. Complexity is increasing. And then we add HAM on top of that. So actually, if you're going to do effective software asset management, that's all in theory installed on hardware. So you should know where all of your hardware is. And actually, perfect example of today, I think we've kind of lined up the rooms the right way. Actually, if your assets are talking to each other, that should be integrated with your service management. If someone's got a problem with a device, is it out there? What does that look like? If someone wants a change to their configuration, what does that mean? And actually, if you're keeping on top of that, CMDB should be up to date. So if you've got a good asset and you're just doing even these pieces correctly, you've got good inventory, which is a lot of the conversation around today. Actually, that can plug in and that can feed your CMDB. So actually, when you're making infrastructure and architectural decisions, that can be fed with good information instead of having issues.
Assets, though, it's all relationships between assets.
Absolutely. And that's again the key piece. And then you add in cloud to that as well. So you've got a piece of software installed locally, and maybe that's replicated in the cloud. And maybe there's a CMDB related to that. We're keeping a record of what they look like. And that then influences our service management and asset management. And then increasingly, we're seeing this term of technology business management thrown around, which is essentially where you take all of the value streams of your business, and then you're trying to categorize who's using that, how are they using that, what does that mean? And ultimately, if you're going to then start to rationalize and only get what you need, you should be taking away everything that isn't driving a business value upwards. So I think we're all feeling confused at the moment. And I think I've spent a lot of time in a room trying to depict what that looked like. And that's because we've gone from this to this in a year or two. And actually, it's getting a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult to keep on top of. And exactly like you said, the nuance to this is talking across all of these. So these are groups of stakeholders that work together towards a common outcome and have a common set of how we're going to measure these things, what they look like, what do they mean. And actually within each of these distinct areas, we're also capturing and doing those pieces effectively. So it's back to talking to each other and doing it effectively instead of everyone in their own little silo. I've got an inventory of my area and I'm not going to talk to you. That's kind of, we need to shift that mindset if we're going to be effective. So in terms of kind of what ITAM looks like, and I'm just going to repeat what everyone said already today, kind of where we are today is we've got data that people don't trust. And this is kind of a bit we touched on in the previous session. I'm struggling to see how we jump to AI and this automated cool stuff if we can't even get a spreadsheet that everyone trusts. Like, it's a big jump. Let's do baby steps. Actually, that's then step 3 or 4. And how do we map the data sources? How to make sure they're accurate? We've got a license tool, we've got a SaaS tool, we've got a CMDB, we've got a service management tool, and we've got all these different things, and none of them add up. So actually, I think a value piece that ITAM can think about is how do we get a trustworthy data source? kind of very common feedback we're receiving is poor tool ROI. So these tools are fantastic and you really struggle to deliver value without them. But sometimes the expectation is a bit bigger and the demo doesn't necessarily stack up to reality a year or two down the line. So actually there are people coming and saying, we've bought this expensive tool. We know that's definitely part of the solution, but actually the maybe people process reporting side of things isn't giving me the outcome beyond that.
Isn't one problem you can measure cost fairly easily and accurately, but measuring value is very difficult?
Exactly, and we'll get to that. Exactly that. So back to sponsorship, which is back to the piece. So if the people sponsoring you don't understand and agree and drive the alignment to the business goals, then the business isn't going to see value. So this is often a piece that we see is it's that low level piece of buying the tool, and actually SAM leaders, you know, talking to their executives, talking to other departments, generating value and generating just good PR to actually understand, you know, a very simple executive challenge. They don't want to see Microsoft ELP with red Visio numbers. They want to see a cost going down in a way they can understand, where they're then going to go in. And maybe if they're under regulatory pressures, which is another spike we're kind of observing at the moment, demonstrate that we have a holistic, you know, regulated view of our asset inventory. Can you guys help me with that? Yeah, absolutely. What does that need to look like? And kind of go into questioning inquisitive mode and then fulfill the needs. And suddenly from that previous slide, you can tune that back to delivering more value for more stakeholders. And the other thing we're seeing, and again, really consistent, I think everyone's spoken to today has brought up the same thing. There's this lack of skills. So SAM has grown significantly. There aren't that many of us with lots of experience around there. So actually, how do we automate? And this is kind of where AI pushes in. How do we manage data in a more effective way? How do we streamline? How do we make a dashboard out of that thing that is consuming 2/3 of someone's headcount? And how do we make that easier? And actually, how do we maybe cut 80% of the stuff that we're doing that isn't delivering value? And actually, this is back to the thing of use the skills more effectively, make it attractive, make it more strategic, make it more valuable, because actually churning, you know, reports in the basement isn't that exciting for a lot of people. And what ITAM can be, and you know, people have really successfully built out, you know, very large ITAM departments, everything from sustainability to FinOps to all these other areas that are interesting, and actually kind of the world's your oyster. If you can get your head around that previous slide with all those different areas in. So one of the other people we often like to look towards is Gartner. I think in the last year, they've kind of changed some of their writers and they're bringing out some really interesting stuff now that certainly agrees with what we're seeing in the market. One of the things they've said is that by 2026, organizations that reposition software asset management from centralized execution to strategic governance and oversight have 30% more efficient spend than those who don't. And this is exactly touching on the things, you know, I just called you out earlier on, all the things you're saying of who are we talking to, what are we doing, what are we trying to do? You know, interesting, by the end of last year, 61% of their interactions related to SAM tools and a mere 13% on governance. So this shows where the industry and where the marketing dollars are probably being spent in terms of what's front of mind for people. But actually, if you can get governance right, you can build a culture with authority and mandate. That's something people will want to be a part of. Suddenly you become an attractive team in the industry. Suddenly you're solving business problems. You're getting noticed by executives. And you're starting to move forward with what that looks like. And in their latest one, I don't know whoever has access, but it's really good again. And they're actually suggesting that the SAM or ITAM capability has a direct or even dotted line straight to the CIO, because a lot of the security and stability pieces can be solved directly. And you just get lost through these kind of layers of communication beneath that.
Yeah, it'd be odd that it takes so long to realise that, since if you don't know what you've got, how can you possibly say you've got security? That's been true for
exactly, and it's still true today.
Yeah.
So many of our engagements certainly are, can you help us figure out what's out there? You know, we're still having that conversation that I was having 20 years ago with Centennial. Yeah. So what we're kind of observing is there's a squeeze going on in terms of where effective SAM looks like today, or ITAM. There's a lot of them being external. Actually, we start to think like the recession. there's a budgetary squeeze on everybody. There is a big threat to growth. You know, even just retaining the same renewal you had last year is a massive challenge for organizations, let alone drive a saving or drive something lower. So this is a pressure. Suddenly, we've got hiring challenges. Job postings on average are open for over 180 days. So you can't get those same people off the shelf, or they're probably twice what you originally had in mind for your budget for those people that do have that experience. So we need to think about different solutions to those problems and how we start to overcome that. Marketplaces are coming. So this is back to that sourcing piece. So, you know, by 2026, 95% of companies will be utilizing marketplaces. So actually, how can we start to streamline that, you know, user need for a piece of software through to fulfillment control, and that's all driven against an approved software catalog, and then you're getting rid of a lot of that that rogue spend, but also maybe allowing some of that rogue spend. So if you've got like very specific SaaS applications that allow one department to do something very specific, we think about the guardrails that we're going to have in place around that, and maybe it's you can do what you like if you're in this department because you're going to drive a significant value to the organization, so long as the data is not in these countries and it doesn't say this or this, or maybe it passes a check through the contract team or the ITAM team to make sure that we're happy with what it's sending up, but then you're not perceived as a blocker, and then you're back to driving those positive relationships across the board. And then pricing increases. So 80% of the top 20 software and SaaS vendors will increase pricing by 25%, citing economic pressures. And we've seen this. I mean, you guys see this every renewal, every commercial discussion that you have. I'm talking to a very well-known organization the other day, and they said they've gone from very little to Oracle now being their largest cloud provider on an ongoing basis, so more than their AWS and Amazon footprint. And that's all driven by the increases in cost being felt like strong-armed into it. And also then the recurring costs, so then you're tied into this contract, you've got that technology lock-in and you can't leave. So this is an issue that a lot of people are having to deal with. And again, think about how you overcome that. Is get close to the architecture teams, the cloud teams, the transformation teams, all of these people. So you're looking forward down the road and you're not trying to catch that next audit letter or that next renewal, and actually you're reinforcing that contract. So you're very much on the front foot and you're managing that effectively. And then similar alongside is this talent war thing, which again, we can certainly attest to in our area of the market of kind of good people get snapped up, they're being paid a lot. It's kind of, it's a difficult place. And actually, how do we attract and retain talent, which is about buying into something. Maybe you're getting that from internally, you're cross training what they look like. So that's from an external side of things. Then we think about the internal side of things. And actually, we've got things like sustainability coming in. So increasingly, we're going to have to look at all of our IT assets and our supply chain and think about what's the footprint of that. And also, how are we managing those vendors? What does that look like? This is an area I can add a lot of value. From an internal perspective, the resource. So again, a lot of enterprises will use SAM as the primary discipline for reducing SaaS contract with dominant vendors. And what we're seeing is you've then got this blind spot where suddenly we're managing our Microsoft, our Oracle through our Flexera, and suddenly we've got 1,000 SaaS vendors that have been bought on credit cards or departmentally. How do we start to understand if they're needed, if they're not needed, if they're adding value, if they're in competition to what we're installing? How do we start to understand that new platform and what that looks like? Audits are still heavy. 55% of non-compliance are in cloud environments. So increasingly, how are we starting to get that view of all of those different pots? Because everyone's still in that SLM side of things. But what is visibility? And again, it's a different type. Again, like the people previously have touched on in the sessions, it's not it says this line, you're using this in the wrong way. It's an interpretation of the product or a key being used multiple times, or maybe in a SaaS environment that we're seeing increasingly these small bespoke SaaS vendors coming in and saying, you owe us this money for this many users. And the same thing, it's, no, this is an AD account, this is not a user. And then it's a different type of negotiation and dialogue that you've got with them. And ultimately, it's this SaaS piece that's increasing significantly. So people have got a SaaS first approach. Every single software vendor pretty much is moving to SaaS. Suddenly scanning our network for the number of copies of WinZip installed may not be effective in really driving down that cost and getting effective. So a proliferation in terms of vendors and also in terms of use cases and areas. And then again, from a contractual side of things, so perpetual license is pretty much dead. It's now subscriptions, it's contracts, it's ongoing agreements. So it's back to being clever in how you negotiate that. What are we being tied into? Make sure a department's not clicking I agree without our knowledge, and what does that look like? So without being too negative and making you feel like the world's against you, I think this is why there's a bit of stress in the ITAM industry at the moment, and all of these things are relatively new.
The world really is against you.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of, the role that a lot of us did only a few years ago, all of these things are new, so it's kind of reacting. But this also, presents opportunity. So actually, in terms of where do we go? So what this is representing is, level 1, if you like, was software license compliance on desktops, and there's still massive value in what that looks like. But actually, if you can open your mind, you can engage with the people involved in these kind of challenges, you can own and take away some of these problems and pains, then people will like you and they will give you more budget and they'll support your program. Because actually you can then start to come up, like the example I think Stuart gave earlier around the water company, and said, well, you are managing a set of devices out there, you can start to think about SaaS cloud, operational technologies. And you can start to, go beyond just license management, but actually towards strategic SAM, and you can help some of your executives with things like budget forecasting. One of the big challenges that we're seeing around FinOps is, I don't know how much every department's going to spend next year. So it's not even about saving money. And if you can go to finance and you can say, well, can you get an accurate figure for how much all of these people are going to spend on Azure next year? And if you can get that within above 90% accuracy to 110, because overspends, underspending is bad as well, I'll be your best friend. And suddenly, just a case of collecting, so what does your growth look like? What does that mean? Where are we coming? And thinking kind of logically about how we start to engage and move up that chain, really. And again, you can't go from here to here. If you've got bad data, you don't even understand this stuff, then do this well, and then step up and move forward as we need to.
See things like managing expertise, finding areas where people are not using a particular piece of software, therefore need training. Do you see that as part of asset management or part of some other group in the organization?
An end user computer or something, yeah. I think it just comes back to talking to people. Are we observing this joint risk? How do we help overcome that? And I come back to that marketplaces thing, which is people going to a store online in your organization, in your service management area, and just automating and streamlining request. So then you're nudging people towards a smaller pool of software that you're kind of built to manage and control.
I suppose reducing silos too, because if you do have separate departments for all these things, people get lost in the gaps.
Exactly, yeah. So in terms of where to start, the biggest piece would be don't be a busy fool. So stop giving ELPs to stakeholders they don't know how to turn into value. And we see this a lot. So ELPs are a very important piece in terms of understanding the value and what it looks like. But actually, if you throw that at the procurement person, they're just going to shrug the shoulders. If you write a 3-slide summary and a 10-minute conversation at the start, then suddenly they'll think it's amazing because you've just made their life easy in terms of what this means in order to save the value and what that looks like. And if you are repeatedly, and again, as a managed service provider, we see this a lot. If you're repeatedly delivering information to people that they don't take action upon and they're not receiving, then the program's broken and there's a problem in terms of communication. So kind of as an asset manager or an ITAM department, you need to understand, why is this not delivering value? What does this look like? This is where we need to, I'll steal one of Kylie's phrases, kind of switch into listening mode really in terms of what this looks like. And kind of tips really is don't assume they all want an ELP because they probably don't know what ELP stands for. You need to switch into gathering customer requirements. So in your role, what are your goals? What are your KPIs? How do I make your life easy? Listen, understand, have an open mind. Don't give them that answer on the spot. Go away and think about it for a week and then come back with maybe how you can help. Because if you think about all these different profiles, actually we're sat on information of, you know, we can't secure it if we don't know what's out there. How do I negotiate this renewal effectively based on the vendor behavior of what they want to see in the industry, and also intelligence around what we're using and not using. And maybe this one line in the contract, you cannot audit. You won't be invited to the RFP if you include an audit clause. You know, a simple line like that can be really powerful. And then vendor management. So again, this piece of kind of what is the vendor behavior? What does it look like? What are we getting from our partners? Leverage the maximum value from your reseller and maybe from your managed service provider to drive straight into DMO. What is, if you don't give me analytics on vendor behavior 6 months before my renewal, then you won't be considered for the renewal of the next contract. And then ESG increasingly, which I think people are still trying to kind of figure out, but I think there's no doubt we're sat on a lot of data that is valuable for that. Again, if you're the ITAM department that figures that out, then good luck to you, and you're doing very, very well because you'll be set up. And then business unit owners. So what we're starting to see is a decentralization of business units and areas, and people acting more as autonomous groups within their businesses and areas. So actually, as a CIO, CEO of maybe a business unit or area, what do you want to see? What does value mean? And then what you can get to is almost like a franchise model, where if you can give us this data and information, we can do this analysis, and we can give this back to these different departments within your business unit and area. And then ultimately the budget holders, so the people sat above them, maybe from the program, and maybe some of these people form some of the budget holders as well. So in 6 or 12 months, what would you want to see that would mean this program has been successful? But just in terms of observations. And something else we've been kind of grappling with as well is ISO 19770, our good friend, which has been a dark art for a long time and extremely boring. But what we've been trying to figure out is, well, there's good stuff in there, but I can't get past page 2 or 3 in the documentation. But actually, how do we take that and give that something which does become a plan and is useful and does mean? So what we've kind of done, and we share this on the slides after, is to unpack it a little bit in terms of what should you consider and what does it look like. So we started thinking, you start with a business plan. So do we have a business plan? Does it have objectives? What do they look like? Do we understand what the stakeholders are? Those people on the previous slide. Do we have a scope? Is it licensing? Is it SaaS? Is it cloud? Is it sustainability? Is it just managing our top 5 vendors? And that's fine. That's a great place to start and get up and running and moving and drive some value quickly. Well, how are we going to communicate with those people? And then from a management system perspective, do we have the processes? Does everybody that needs to input into this understand what they need to do to make this overall thing be successful? Do we maintain an asset register? Does anyone else look at this to see if it's successful? And this is where you can use internal governance maybe as a stick or an area. If we can give you good diagnosed risk around software, what would that look like? What would you want to see? How do you do that? And then again, you're getting more sponsorship and control. And it's a bit of a top-down, bottom-up thing on leadership. Kind of, you've got enough to get them interested, but then at the point they're interested, are they going to support all of these policies and processes and controls? And if they are going to sign off on a policy that says, 6 months before every renewal, or if we get an audit letter, you will engage in this set of activities, which is don't reply with, send it to corporate, legal, and they will reply with this fixed text. Don't do this, do that. And actually, are they going to support that and drive that up and downwards? And what we've kind of got to is this a bit of a model whereby you start by designing what those objectives are and what we're trying to achieve. So actually, what are the organizational objectives? What is important to our business and organization as a whole? Do we have them at the core? What's each department trying to achieve off the back of that? And then is the program aligned to what each of those areas are trying to achieve above? And then what are our North Star metrics? And these are great things to start to talk about with a leader of, we had a great one a couple of months ago, actually. Like, I want KPI of 0 audit spend. And I want that measured quarterly, which is perfect, because then it's in plain English, the organization gets it, it's managed, it's controlled. And then actually what you do is you buffer them with the stakeholder expectations and budget holder expectations. Then you start to drive this conversation around. If you want these things at the bottom, I need help getting these things and these things. And we're all crystal clear on what the scope is, whatever it needs to do, what the resources are,